Welcome to the shop and welcome to the first video on my second channel, and we're starting off big. As soon as I saw the Kickstarter for Trench Crusade and I started reading the lore, I knew that this is a project that I wanted to undertake. I wanted a complete modular terrain system where all of the elements could be moved around and swapped out for each and every scenario. This is going to be a multi-video step-by-step process on how I'm going to bring my board to life. So if you're interested in that or you want to make your own, feel free to subscribe and follow along. Needless to say, we've got a lot to do, so let's get started. Now for the base of my gaming boards, I'm going to be using some 1/2" MDF, which is going to be great because it's nice and sturdy, but because of the material thickness, I don't have to add an additional support structure underneath. Now to protect any table that these may go on, I also added some 6mm HD foam to the bottom, using some PL300 for foam board. This stuff works great on XPS foam and EVA foam, especially on porous surfaces. Now the Trench Crusade developers said that the game board should technically be about 3x3 or 4x4. Because I'm going to be putting a lot of effort into this, I want to be able to use it for multiple gaming systems. So I'm actually going to be adding an additional leaf that can go in the middle so I can use it for large-scale Warhammer 40K and Warhammer Fantasy. So my main goal with this gaming board is to have a modular landmass and trench system, which means the base structure for the ground here, I want pretty uniform. I don't want a lot of hills to it or anything. I kind of want to go for a muddy look. No matter where these trenches or landmasses are placed, that same uniform texture and color will be underneath. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to draw out some basic trench shapes and just see how they look placed around the board. And I'm going to do this using some poster board. So I decided to draw up a whole bunch of random designs, and I did this on a 2-inch grid, and you can see even here you can come up with a pretty cool battle scenario fairly quickly. And because it is a 2-inch grid, most of the characters up to a base size of about 50 to 60mm should be able to move through this without any issues. Throughout the system you can see I have some smaller trench pieces, but Trench Crusade also has some large objectives where your relics that you pick up are at. And a lot of those are contained within broken down buildings or bunkers. So I'm going to be adding some very large scale terrain pieces to accommodate those for the victory points. The trenches themselves are going to be made out of a 2-inch insulation foam, and this is stuff that I picked up at Home Depot. It does look kind of expensive initially when you look at it, but the sheet size is gigantic. You actually get a ton of material for the money. From here, I'm going to take my poster board templates, I'm going to trace them onto the foam, and then I'm going to cut those out on my Proxxon wire cutter. Now one trick I'd like to point out here is that I have some hash marks that are applied with some painter's tape, and these allow me to adjust the angle of my wire pretty quickly. So I know here that this is a 90, we've got 85, 80, and so on, and you can have as many of these hash marks as you need for your projects. Turn the machine on and you can adjust the heat to get the temperature you need for your wire, and I'd always recommend to have scrap pieces of foam around to test this out. That has a good cut to it, and it's not scorching or overly heating the foam, which is what you want to see. And like I said, these cuts don't need to be perfect. In fact, we don't want them perfect. We want this to look a little organic, as though they've been dug out of the soil. And when heating up any type of foam, I would always recommend to wear a respirator and work in a well-ventilated area. I'll have a link in the description to a PDF that'll have the basic sizes that I used in case you would like to make your own. But you could also just use this video for inspiration and come up with any shapes that you would like for your board. So at this point, I've got all of my trench sections rough cut, and I started to lay them out just to see how modular they are. And because I had done all of this on that kind of 2-inch grid system, they work together really well, even making sections that could be elevated for miniatures that are needing to have that line of sight. Now it's time to start detailing these out, and of course I'm going to be using the Holy Trinity when it comes to trench crafting. Some corrugated paper, some skewers, and some coffee stir sticks. Now one thing I will note on these is that I looked for Amazon reviews that weren't necessarily the best because I wanted some variety in the wood, and these did not disappoint. Some of them are really good, some of them are questionable, but I'll be sure to link these down below. Now, these are just the trench sections themselves. I do plan on eventually adding some land masses that can be incorporated into this system, kind of a no man's land in the middle. But for now, let's go ahead and start detailing all of these sections. The sides of my modular trenches will have a layered look. The corrugated paper on the bottom, the coffee stir sticks on top, and the bamboo skewers are going to act as reinforcements. Now, to attach all these pieces to the foam, I'm going to be using my SureBonder high temp hot glue gun. Now, the coffee stir sticks are quite sturdy, so to trim away any excess material, I'm going to be using some old leather shears. To give an extra layer of detail to the stir sticks, I'm going to rough up the surface using a wire brush. The process of applying the stir sticks to the foam can then be repeated for all 4 sides. Now, for some variation, I did change the height of the corrugated paper for different pieces. Once the stir sticks have been attached, I can then mark and cut the corrugated paper to see how it's going to fit. With that size looking perfect, I do want to apply some color to the corrugated paper, so I'm going to dust on some flat antique nickel. This isn't applied to cover the paper, just to give it a slight metallic sheen. Now I can cut all the strips that I need for this trench section. The corrugated paper is also going to be applied to the surface using the same hot glue gun. Just like the stir sticks, additional material can be trimmed flush as I work my way around the piece. Before I attach the bamboo skewers, I do want to distress them a bit. So to add some variation to the surface, I use my Dremel rotary tool and a wire brush. This is going to help make them look not so perfectly round. With my sticks roughed up, I can now hot glue them directly to the trench. I go ahead and mark the approximate height with a pencil, and then I can remove excess material using a mini saw. I repeated this process on the first couple sticks that I attached, but once I was happy with the size, I then cut out multiple pieces using my bandsaw so I could assemble these quicker. So that the trench sections did not all look the same, I did go ahead and attach some brace beams here and there. This is going to help break up the look for all the different scatter terrain. Another small detail that you could add to your boards is by using a metal awl. This tool can be pressed into the wood to replicate nail holes. Because the insulation foam is so light, 1, 2, 3 blocks work great to hold the foam at a perfect angle. Now, one mistake that I had made on my first trench was that I had the boards a little too uniform. So you're going to notice on all the other sections that I assembled that there's going to be much more variety. And this is a great way to utilize some of those offcuts. Just like the stir sticks, sometimes I'd break up the corrugated panels as well. The 1, 2, 3 blocks also help when keeping the bamboo reinforcements at a 90-degree angle. And here you can see I'm starting to give some of those sections a little bit of character. Now, of course, all these pieces are supposed to be replicating a fictional battle. So having sections that look like they've been quickly mended or haphazard works great for this application. Now, throughout my modular battlefield, I also want certain sections to look like concrete. These are going to be perfect for reliquary areas or bunkers. So my first piece is going to be an octagon with a slight bevel on each side. The 1, 2, 3 blocks once again come in handy, this time defining a staircase that will lead to the top. The biggest thing to note is when making stairs for miniatures, even though your character may not be able to stand on them because of their base, you still want to scale them to a height that a step would be. High temp hot glue is going to be used to affix the stair section back into the piece. But for additional detail sections, I'm going to switch over to a low temp glue gun. That way I don't run the risk of melting these smaller sections of foam. And of course, one of my all-time favorite distressing techniques is using balled up foil. Now, even though the main material for this section is going to look like concrete, I do want to add some wooden elements to give a variety of texture and color. Attaching the stir sticks to the sides and distressing them makes it look as though they're helping reinforce the walls to keep them from crumbling. This is one of those things that's really great because you could add as many or as few details as you want to your piece. Now the top half of the structure will be concrete, and I have my wood element, but I figured let's go ahead and add some metal in there as well. So I'm going to use more of the corrugated paper along the bottom. Just like the trench sections, this paper is hot glued into place, and then any excess can be trimmed away with some scissors. Using the side of this piece to tell a story, I decided that I want it to look as though a mortar shell had destroyed part of the wall. Again, I want this piece to replicate as though it's concrete, so we're going for chunks and cracks. Another way to help simulate a lot of random damage is by once again using that wire brush. And I have a bunch of the bamboo skewer pieces laying around to help me simulate the damage and bullet holes. I want the support beams for this piece to be different than the trenches, so instead of using the bamboo skewers, I'm using the coffee stir sticks here. That way this piece stands out a little bit more, and it can be used as a special element on the board. I decided I wanted a blast on top as well, and I'm just continuing to use that collection of knives, wire brushes, and bamboo skewers. Using one or the other heavily on an area can greatly differentiate the overall look. Another thing to be mindful of are your offcuts. Sometimes these look great and can be glued back on to make it look as though the earth is erupting from below. To accompany this piece, I decided to make another large concrete area. This set of stairs is a little bit longer, so it's going to have a landing at the bottom that the miniature can stand on, and then use its additional movement to get to the top. This section will be featured more in the Part 2 video, where I go over the steps that it will take to make these sections look like stone. Going back to my trenches, I start to use my rotary tool to dig out some craters. You can definitely cut them out by hand, but this is a much quicker process. After the foam has been sanded down, a heat gun can then be used to help melt and distress the surface. Because I am melting foam, I make sure that the fan at the back of the shop is blowing, and I definitely am wearing my respirator. But this is a really cool technique, and even if you weren't going to cover this surface with Sculptamold, you have some nice organic shapes happening. And depending on the amount of detail that you want to add, you could also simulate some bullet holes using that metal awl. For this trench section, I want it to look as though a good chunk of the wall has been blown away. Using my hot wire cutter and holding the trench at an angle, I can easily remove the foam. Using some more coffee stir sticks, I'm trying to make it look as though they boarded it up quickly but haven't gone back to complete their job. After a quick heat treat, you can see how a couple extra steps of customization give you a really unique piece for your game board. So I have a few of my terrain pieces fabricated, but it is not freezing outside today, so I would like to try to work on my base structure. And again, this is 1/2" MDF, so the first thing I'm going to do is use some Krylon Red Oxide Primer. That's going to help prep the surface for any additional paints or the caulking itself, but it's going to help seal the surface so the material won't absorb as much. From there, I'm going to be using some of the Dynaflex 230. This is a brown, so it's going to help with the painting process, but this is also a paintable product. And that is very important because once that is all dry, I'm of course going to go back and dry brush and highlight certain areas. From there, to help texture it, I'm going to be using a spatula to help smooth it around, as well as my hands. And I've got a roller to also help with that process. And then I'm going to be adding some medium ballast and sand into that mixture. I will say this can be a messy process, and the silicone does take a little time to dry. So make sure you have the space where these can sit out and lay flat while the silicone cures. So it's been a day later and all of the caulking has dried on here and it looks really cool. There's a lot of texture to it, and I like the fact, again, that I can move all these pieces around and still have this mud base. Now, as you can see here, I'm adding a no man's land area, and this is going to be a large landmass. It's going to have a lot of different like trees and different kind of structures in it. I'm also going to add elements in here that are going to be like ruined buildings and different types of walls that can be put up and around, and of course sandbags, which that I will tackle later on. For my no man's land, on one side I want to remove enough foam that my characters can run uphill. Now I've designed these sections so they can be split up and face each other on each side of the battlefield. But if the scenario calls for it, they can be placed together in the middle of the battlefield for a true no man's land. To protect the back edge of each piece and so that they fit flush together, I'm going to be adhering some poster board. Like the other elements of the trench, this is attached using some high-temp hot glue. The sides and the front of these large sections are going to be covered in full sheets of the corrugated paper, again giving a slightly different look between them and the modular trenches. Here you can see how multiple modular sections can be laid out and stacked upon each other. Just like the trenches, the no man's land is going to require a lot of craters. I started by defining some very large ones in the middle and then slowly working my way to the outside. Now I am being mindful of other buildings or structures that I would also like to use in these areas. After enough foam had been cut away, I could then switch over to my rotary tool to define some of these areas. I also wanted to make sure that there were craters that would join both pieces if the two halves were put together. I'm going to be burning a lot of foam with this process, so once again I'm wearing my respirator. I also opened up my garage door and turned on the fan at the back of the shop, just to blow out as many of the fumes as possible. Throughout the making process, there were other sections that I did not film. These now also receive their additional heat treatments onto the foam. With the foam cauterized, I can now place the two baseboards onto my table, so I can check the fit of the no man's land craters. Any additional foam or paper that's sticking up can be easily trimmed away using a hobby knife. And I love this setup. You can have the fight in the middle, or break it up and have your skirmish on either side. So with my foam heat sealed, I wanted to lay out all the pieces yet again just to see how modular this is. I love the fact that I'm starting to get some layers going on here, so I'm going to have some line of sights. And this is even before I add any additional accessories or buildings or additional like larger terrain pieces. From this point, I want to start to add some things down into the base area where the mud is. And to do that, I'm going to be putting in some duck boards. These are also going to be made out of the coffee stir sticks. It's going to be time consuming, but it's going to turn out fantastic. Using some poster board, I created a basic template for the duck boards. And for the scale of my miniatures, they're approximately 5.5 inches long and about 1.5 inches wide. Each board was placed individually based on the template, and then I used my awl to make some nail holes and the wire brush to distress the surface. So I got quite a bit done today. The main things being heat sealing all of the foam that I want to look like soil. Leaving ones that are eventually going to be concrete. I'm going to detail those completely separate. I was also able to make a ton of these duck boards, which I know it's a lot of work and a lot goes into it. It's one of those things literally like find a movie or a podcast to put on and just zone out and put these together for a couple of hours. But this is the kind of details that I absolutely love, and it really is what makes an overall display. At this point, there are a few details that I still need to add to some of these pieces, but I want to start adding some Sculptamold as well to the foam, and that's going to allow me to detail some of these just a little bit more, but also really start to showcase some of these craters that are off in the distance, because eventually with those, I would also like to add some water effects and stuff to them to really make them pop and sell the believability of the terrain. Based on the height of the insulation foam, I'm also going to need to create some fire steps for the miniatures to stand on. Small blocks of the foam were cut out using the wire cutter, and then I could hot glue on more coffee stir sticks. These were left to overlap on the top and the sides, and I was able to then trim away any excess. I once again distressed the surface and sanded the edges, and now I've got a whole bunch of fire steps that are modular and can be moved for any scenario. Now I'm going to prep my area to start working with the Sculptamold. For this process, I'm going to need a mixing bowl, and I like to use distilled water so I don't have any bacteria issues. I would also highly recommend to wear some gloves and a mask at least until the plaster has been saturated. To have a decent working time, I mix this up in small batches at a 2-to-1 ratio of Sculptamold to distilled water. The mixture can then be pressed onto the surface in small sections. And the reason to work in small batches is that it does tend to kick fairly quickly. So before it has a chance to set, I want to go in with my fingers and some sculpting tools to create some craters or variations in the surface. Another trick for the Sculptamold is that once you have it mixed up, spread it out evenly around the interior of the bowl. The more the material is packed together, the faster it's going to cure, so spreading it out will delay the process. Once the top had been covered, you'll notice that I also wet my fingers and apply some to the wood and the corrugated paper below. Right now it just looks like some dried white material on there, but later on I'm going to add some stain and it's really going to pop. Now, because of the amount of material I had to apply, this process did take quite a while, but the end result will be worth it. On the No Man's Land sections, once I had the Sculptamold applied to one half, I put them together. That way I could apply the material to help try to mimic it for the opposite side. The material was also used to help cover any damaged areas or seams in the foam. To make sure that any additional accessories or terrain pieces could sit flush on the surface, I used the polished side on a granite tile to press the Sculptamold flat. All the pieces were then left to dry in my shop for a couple of days. During that time, I was able to find a whole bunch of 3D scatter terrain online. All these pieces were then printed out on my bamboo, and they're going to help flush out the believability of the board. To prevent the Sculptamold from having any chipping or wear, I'm going to mix up some more silicone sealant. This is once again going to be the DAP 230 Brown, along with some medium ballast and sand. But this time I'm also going to add some cheap craft paint to tint it and some isopropyl alcohol. The alcohol is going to help thin the mixture and make it easily paintable for the surface. After it all had been thoroughly mixed, a brush can then be used to apply the silicone mixture directly to the surface. One thing to be mindful with this mixture is that it will retain brush strokes. So once it had been applied, I'll go back and stipple the surface to get rid of these. Now for the first coat, I'm just trying to apply as much as possible, but I will go back with a selective second coat to cover any areas that might be too thin or any spots where a little bit of white is showing through. All of the terrain pieces were then left to dry overnight. Because I had added the paint to this mixture, it has a slightly different tint to what I had added to the MDF boards. So this is a good time to cut a chip brush down and add some variation to the boards that'll go underneath of the modular terrain. I have a lot of wood elements going on, and rather than painting them to look like wood, I'm going to be using some dark walnut stain. This is a water-based stain for easy cleanup, and it can be applied to all of the wood elements and the corrugated paper. So you can see here the reason I apply it to the paper as well is that the plaster that I had dabbed on earlier now absorbs the stain and helps it look like rust. Now in the final product, I am going to go back and dry brush some of the boards and the corrugated paper, but this is a great way to lay down one base coat and help harmonize all of the colors. The dark walnut stain is also applied to the sides of the no man's land area as well. While all the terrain pieces are allowed to dry, I also apply some stain to the fire steps and the duck boards. And in between sessions, I did craft some bridges that will go on the terrain as well. So I think this is a decent place to stop for the end of part 1, but by no means is this anywhere near complete. In part 2, we're going to start bringing everything to life by painting. And those that have followed me from my prop and costume channel know I absolutely love painting, I love my layers, and this project will be of no exception to that. So I hope you enjoyed this part 1 tutorial, and I hope to see you again for part 2.